Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Critical Issues Forum Online Teachers Workshop. Today, we are going to have a lecture on Iran nuclear issues and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This is a very timely and important topic for this year's Critical Issues Forum. So today's speaker is Mr. Joe Brazda. So let me introduce Joe briefly. Joe is a senior level manager who manages the financial for all of CNS, as well as carrying numerous organizational responsibilities. Additionally, Joe conducts research in a variety of topics, both independently and in partnership with other senior research staff, as well as assisting Dr. William Porter in his Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty simulation course. Joe lectures to our visiting fellows on diverse topics such as Iran, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, and international organizations in the context of non-proliferation. He spent 2 years as a graduate research assistant, conducting research in export controls and illicit procurement networks, as well as contributing towards the first online Middlebury's course in export compliance. His areas of research include export controls, Iranian illicit procurement networks. Joe earned his BA in political science with a certification in Arabic and international relations from Arizona State University, graduating summa cum laude. He went on to earn his MA in Non-Proliferation and Terrorism Studies from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Montreal. So today I'm happy to introduce Joe Brazda to the CIF participants. So now I am going to mute. So Joe, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Welcome everyone. Today's topic will be related to the Iranian nuclear fuel cycle and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was concluded in July of 2015. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action began as a Joint Plan of Action, which was a series of provisions within a potential agreement that was discussed over a 2-year time period between the Foreign Ministry of Iran and the Secretary of State of the United States through a back channel set up within the country of Oman. This lasted for 2 years and ultimately culminated in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Now, when the Joint Plan of Action was first introduced at the Board of Governors meeting at the IAEA in 2013, most professionals within non-proliferation did not believe that the Iranians would agree to most of the provisions that were within that deal. They were very, very intrusive. There were many unique provisions that no other country had agreed to. And with the Iranians' history of its positions on what it felt it was entitled to for peaceful uses under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, we didn't believe that they were going to agree to almost any of these provisions. 21 months later, after intense negotiations with the P5+1, which is the US, France, England, Russia, China, Germany, and the EU, they concluded what became known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was signed in July of 2015. And much to all of our surprise, the Iranians agreed to pretty much everything that was in the Joint Plan of Action. So my intention in this lecture is to go through the deal and take a look at the provisions as they relate to the Iranian facilities and gain a greater clarity as to why experts in the field and the IAEA believe that the JCPOA provisions block both paths to a nuclear weapon for the Iranian program. So we'll start off with the key provisions as they relate to the Iranian enrichment program. The Iranians agreed to limit their low enriched uranium to 300 kilograms at 3.67% for 15 years. Now, what this means is that they cannot have more than 300 kilograms. They cannot enrich higher than 3.67%. And the significance of this is 3.67% is not enough for a nuclear weapon. You will need something above 20%, with the ideal range being above 90%. And 300 kilograms were enriched further from 3.67 to 90% would reduce the amount down to next to zero, and you would not have nearly enough material as you would need for a nuclear weapon. The Iranians agreed to reduce their inventory of centrifuges from 19,000 down to 5,060 for 10 years, and limited to something called an IR-1. This is the type of machine that the Iranians procured from the Pakistanis back in the 80s, which is very, very old technology. And I'll discuss the significance of this a little bit further on. The Iranians then agreed that they would store their excess machines under IAEA monitoring, continuous monitoring, for 20 years, and that they would dismantle them and remove the rotors and the bellows. Furthermore, the Iranians agreed to remove the supporting infrastructure. So if you look at this picture of Natanz, you'll see the centrifuge machines, and they have an immense amount of wiring and tubing and cabling and all of this infrastructure that is needed to operate these centrifuges. All of it is going to be removed so that this, what they call this cascade hall, will be completely empty. So now we're starting to get into some of the provisions that we believe are very, very unique to this deal. And something that we didn't think that the Iranians would agree to. So moving forward, the Iranians have agreed to limit the amount of research and development that they would apply to advanced machines. And those machines that were allowed to be researched within those limitations would be under constant IAEA monitoring. Now, the next provision is something that it's very, very unusual in that this is outside of the IAEA's mandate. The International Atomic Energy Agency concerns itself with fissile material, nuclear material, and it is not within its mandate to inspect or verify any type of facility or technology that doesn't have fissile material associated with it. So the next provision that the Iranians agreed to is that they would be transparent when it comes to their centrifuge manufacturing facilities. They were going to allow the IAEA to inspect these facilities and to monitor the interior production, which is the bellows and rotors. So this is important so that it can be ensured that the Iranians would not be able to manufacture centrifuges that they could then divert to a clandestine facility in an undeclared enrichment program. Taking that one step further, the machines that are used to form these centrifuges are called flow form machines. And these are a very technologically advanced machine because they have to form these casings and these rotors of the centrifuge to a very high specification due to the speed by which they spin. So these are a controlled machine. You have to have a license to sell it or receive it from any manufacturing state. And the Iranians have agreed to declare what machines they have and where they're located and place them under monitoring. So they're not only do these initial provisions provide insight into the Iranian program that is unique relative to other inspection and verification programs to IAEA member states, but it moves outside of nuclear related sites to manufacturing facilities that have no nuclear material related to them whatsoever, making this very intrusive and making it very unique in the realm of safeguards and verification. So the Iranians are allowed to keep 5,060 IR-1s. So what does that mean? So IR-1s, I've mentioned, are very, very old technology. And these machines were procured from the Pakistanis in the 80s. Now they're very, very prone to breaking down. They're not secure. They are open to cyber intrusion. So they're vulnerable, and they do not fit into any type of long-term modernizations. These machines are obsolete, and they do not have a very high output. So the Ayatollah Khamenei stated that the Iranians' goal in enrichment production would equate to 190,000 SWUs. Now, what a SWU is, this is an acronym, is a separative work unit. This is a measure of efficiency of the output of a centrifuge. How efficient is it at enrichment depending upon the type of stock it was fed? 190,000 SWUs would allow for a nuclear weapons program, and is a much higher output than anything that the Iranians need for their existing peaceful uses facilities. So this is a very large goal. An IR-1 at its best puts out about 1.03 SWUs per year. So they would need 190,000 of these machines to achieve the stated goal of the Ayatollah and have 190,000, which would again be enough for a nuclear weapons program. So that's significant. Now, their reliability, they break down all the time. And when they break down, generally they cannot be put back together again. They spin at a very high rate of speed inside of these casings, generally somewhere in the vicinity of 1,100 rotations per second. So if there's any kind of a problem within the interior of these casings, these machines will tend to break apart and just basically blow themselves to pieces. So they're vulnerable. And I'm gonna talk about something right now that's going to have significance later on in this program. There was a virus that was introduced at the Natanz enrichment facility several years back that was allegedly produced by the US and Israeli government in conjunction. And what this virus did is it blinded the operators at Natanz as to what was happening within the centrifuges themselves. So what that means is this: when you're an operator at a centrifuge, when you're at a enrichment production facility like this, you need to know if there's any type of an anomaly, any type of a wobble in the spin of any machine. As soon as it happens, you can take that machine offline and repair it. If you don't do that, that machine will break itself apart and you will disrupt the production of enriched uranium. So this virus that was introduced to Natanz was called Stuxnet. And what Stuxnet did was it convinced the operators that all of their machines were operating normally. So when machines started wobbling, which they do, the operators did not know that. And this resulted in a large number of machines breaking apart and causing a shutdown in Iran's enrichment program because of this. So they're vulnerable, and the Stuxnet virus demonstrated how serious the damage could be due to this vulnerability. So the reality of having only 5,060 IR-1s is demonstrated in this chart, that you can see that the Iranian enrichment program and its centrifuges was increasing dramatically all the way up into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And when that happened, you can see it dropped down to the 5,060 mark for the next 10 years. There are those who now speak out against this particular deadline it's called a sunset clause, that after 10 years, the Iranians will be able to install as many machines as they want and increase their enrichment to levels where they can start storing large amounts of enriched uranium as they see fit. And that's not true. And we'll talk about that a little further on in this talk as well. So let's go to some specific facilities that are included in the language of the deal. By limiting the centrifuge and the highly enriched uranium production abilities of the Iranians, the JCPOA has effectively blocked one path to a nuclear weapon, and that's with highly enriched uranium, weapons-grade uranium. The other path to a nuclear weapon is through processing plutonium. Now, plutonium is a man-made material that is reprocessed through spent fuel. So fuel that is used in a nuclear reactor, whether it's a research or a power reactor, contains plutonium. Through a chemical reprocessing procedure, that plutonium can be extracted and used to make a nuclear weapon. So the Iranians had constructed a heavy water research reactor clandestinely. The world did not know that they had built this facility until it was declared by an Iranian dissident group, and then the IAEA found it, and everyone was alerted that they had this facility. The problem within the heavy water research reactor is that it is a plutonium production facility as well. The fuel that is spent out of a research reactor is rich in plutonium, and that plutonium can be extracted for a weapons program. So the Iranians built this reactor. It was a very significant source of pride with the Iranian people. All of the technology and materials that went into this research reactor was either indigenously developed or it was illicitly procured. In other words, they had to buy this material on a black market through brokers and illegal channels in order to build this facility. So they built this facility, and it has a lot of positive capabilities when it comes to research and the application of that research through agriculture, industry, and power and medical applications. So this was a very big accomplishment for the Iranian scientific community, but also conversely, it was also a very large concern for the non-proliferation community because A, it was undeclared and was not being inspected, and B, it could produce enough plutonium for a nuclear weapon. So through the negotiations of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, these Iranians agreed to redesign this reactor so it does not produce enough weapons-grade plutonium. They agreed to remove the calandria, which is the core of the reactor, and fill in with cement so it would be inoperable. It could never be reinstalled. And then design a new core that would not produce nearly enough waste to allow for the extraction of plutonium for a weapon. Additionally, the Iranians agreed to ship all spent fuel out of the country for the life of the reactor, and that they would not build any new heavy water reactions, and they would not accumulate any heavy water. And the reason that that is included is, again, if they build a clandestine facility that requires heavy water, they would not be able to have that produce that water indigenously without the IAEA knowing it. So this is another way of shutting down their ability to operate clandestinely and supply the materials that they need to do that themselves. So finally, they in the spirit of the deal, they did not, because they do not have any reprocessing facilities, the Iranians have agreed on no reprocessing for 15 years, no research and development on reprocessing, and the agreement really means that they would never reprocess. So that effectively blocks the second path to a nuclear weapon. So let's look at it from another angle. What does this mean? What does it mean to the Iranians? Well, now you can see a calandria. This reactor core contains the coolant, the moderator, and the fuel. that operates the reactor. And in this schematic of the reactor, you can see that at the center, this is the core of this reactor. This is the heart of the reactor. So the Iranians had to build this large, technically advanced component for this reactor indigenously. They had to design it, procure the materials clandestinely because they could not get it licensed, and create this on their own. So this was something that we did not think that they would budge on when it came to redesigning this and pulling this calandria out and rendering it inoperable, but ultimately they did. They also agreed that after 90 days at the beginning of the deal, they would limit themselves to 90 tons of heavy water production, which is significant in that that's not enough to operate a clandestine facility. They need all that for the facility they have. It reduces the potential of plutonium production to 1 kilogram per year. And what's significant is if you're going to create a nuclear weapon using plutonium as your weapons material, you'll need at least 4 kilograms. So it would take 4 years and a reprocessing facility that they do not possess for this reactor to produce enough material for a nuclear weapon. Now, there is something that has been, there's an entity formed to monitor compliance and to act as a dispute resolution mechanism for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and that's called the Joint Commission. And the Joint Commission consists of all of the partners to the deal, including the Iranians. So the Joint Commission has formed a working group that is in charge of redesigning the reactor as a low power research reactor, and then all of the labs that will be created and maintained to process the research that comes out of this will all be approved and monitored by the IAEA. And this is an ongoing agreement. That this provision does not sunset. The IAEA has monitored the design and now the construction of the new reactor core, and all of the fuel and future fuel will be inspected by the IAEA. So what all of this means is that the Iranians produced this research reactor and then turned around and agreed to redesign and redevelop it into something that's much safer and much less likely to contribute to proliferation, and to have the IAEA inspect it in the most intrusive way possible for the life of the reactor, effectively blocking plutonium as a path towards nuclear weapon. So we've talked about the IAEA. Let's go in a little bit and understand what its role is and how we got to where we are. So there was something called a possible military dimension to the Iranian program. Now, the Iranians have insisted there was no nuclear weapons program at any point in their history in their nuclear program. But there was questions in the IAEA. For about 10 years, this was something that's been debated and discussed at the IAEA Board of Governors meetings. And the IAEA, they wanted answers. They wanted to close this file. And this was something that was related to sanctions. It's kept sanctions. This was one of the reasons the Iranians were sanctioned as heavily as they were, because the suspicion they had a program. So in order for this deal to be implemented, the IAEA and the Iranians had to get together and close this particular question to the satisfaction of the IAEA, and this was done. Now, the Iranians must ratify the additional protocol in agreement with the IAEA, and they have to conform to something called the Modified Code 3.1. So this is important in that if you turn the clock back to when Natanz and Iraq and Fordo, another enrichment facility, were first discovered, there was a debate between the Iranians and the IAEA as to whether the Iranians had violated their safeguards agreement with the IAEA by having these undeclared facilities. And this ultimately led to the IAEA referring the Iranian file to the United Nations Security Council which implemented sanctions, which was followed by U.S. and EU sanctions. And the debate revolved around something called the Modified Code 3.1. This was a code that the Iranians had agreed to before it was modified that meant this. The Iranians had agreed with their comprehensive safeguards agreement with the IAEA that they would declare any nuclear facility, any new facility, 180 days before, no later, they introduced any fissile material to the facility. Well, after the Gulf War, the IAEA modified this particular provision to its comprehensive safeguards agreement and mandated that all of the member states comply. And the way they modified it was, now it was no longer sufficient to declare a new facility 180 days before introducing fuel. Now facilities had to be declared during the design phase. So here lies this is the heart of the disagreement. The Iranian, when Natanz and Fordow and Iraq were discovered, the IAEA declared the Iranians to be in violation with Modified Code 3.1. The Iranians came back and said, we never agreed to the modified code. We agreed that we would declare our new facilities 180 days before we introduced fuel. The IAEA claimed they didn't have a choice, and the Security Council agreed with the IAEA, and that is when the Iranians first went under United Nations Security Council sanctions. So, fast forward, now we have the JCPOA. The Iranians have agreed to Modified Code 3.1, so they completely backed off on their stance on that, something that they felt so strongly about back in the early 2000s that it became something that instituted sanctions. They also have agreed to ratify the additional protocol. And what the additional protocol is, it's a protocol that was it's a voluntary agreement between the IAEA and member states that allows the IAEA to inspect undeclared facilities. And that's the key term. When you're a member state and you negotiate your initial comprehensive safeguards agreement with the agency and you become a member state, you have to declare to the agency what all your facilities are and what all of their capacities are and where they're located and all the information that the agency needs in order to set up its inspection regime. Now, these are only declared facilities, and because in the first Gulf War, it was discovered that Saddam Hussein had a clandestine facility, nuclear weapons program, next to the same site of a declared facility that was a peaceful uses inspected facility. The IAEA realized that only inspecting declared facilities wasn't enough. Saddam Hussein was taking material and technology that he procured legally through legal channels and diverting it clandestinely to a nuclear weapons program in an undeclared facility. So the IAEA wrote the additional protocol and put it out to member states as a voluntary addition to their agreements that allows the IAEA to inspect any facility that they believe they need to inspect. So the Iranians have agreed to this. So now they've opened themselves up to the most intrusive inspection and verification regime that any member state that are part of the IAEA has ever agreed to. To take this one step further, the IAEA is now able to inspect the entire fuel cycle, which includes mining and milling. The significance of this is that when you have a safeguards agreement with the IAEA and they set up how they are going to inspect your facilities, inspection begins at the conversion phase of the nuclear fuel cycle, which is a couple of steps ahead of mining uranium out of the ground. Mines and milling of the raw uranium into yellowcake, that process is not inspected by the IAEA, by any member. No member state has agreed to that inspection. It happens after those two steps. The IAEA wanted to inspect the Iranians' mining program so they could ensure that the Iranians had no raw uranium that they could divert to a clandestine fuel production facility. So by inspecting their mines, and the Iranians agreed to this. So they're the only member state of the IAEA that has their uranium mines inspected. Now, to add another restriction that no other state has agreed to further the IAEA's vision into the Iranian program, the Joint Commission has established a working group which created a procurement channel. So this procurement channel is the only way the Iranians can legally purchase any material or technologies for any of their nuclear facilities. This procurement channel is monitored by the Joint Commission. So this effectively shuts down all the illicit procurement channels that the Iranians had set up so that they could build all these facilities without the world knowing about it. Now the Iranians have to purchase all of their materials and technologies through a channel that's monitored by the Joint Commission. In addition to this, and one of the most unique and important provisions of the deal is that there is now a dispute mechanism with a time limit. I'm not going to discuss that at this moment, but I'm going to talk about that in a minute because that's very unique and it's very important. I mentioned earlier on that once the centrifuge production provision sunsets, that there are those that say that will open the door for the Iranians to start enriching at any pace and any enrichment level that they would like, and could start, sprinting towards stockpiling enough highly enriched uranium for a weapons program. This provision here with the IAEA is what was put in place to prevent that. The long-term enrichment plan is coordinated with the IAEA after these provisions expire. So what that means is that the Iranians can't just start spinning centrifuges and stockpiling all of this enriched uranium. They can only enrich and stockpile what has been agreed to between the Iranian scientists and the IAEA as is appropriate to the facilities they currently have. So that is how the IAEA steps in to make sure that the Iranians are not going to start stockpiling HEU that could ultimately be diverted into a weapons program. So the EU has a provision within the deal that relates to their sanctions. And what you need to understand is that when a state or an organization of states or the UN determines that they are going to apply sanctions against any state, they have to craft and pass legislation. You cannot just say, I'm sanctioning you. There has to be legislation that defines who's being sanctioned, what's being sanctioned, what are the limits of the sanctions, is there any kind of a waiver involved? There are all kinds of details that have to be codified into law. And once that's done, then that's completed, then after that process is through, you can apply your sanctions. So the EU regulation that was created that monitors EU sanctions on Iran will expire in 8 years as long as Iran is in compliance. So this is a carrot for the Iranians. This is something that they want to achieve. They would like this regulation to expire because then if the EU at some point down the road wants to reapply sanctions, they will have to craft new legislation and go through that entire process again. If the Iranians could reach something called the broader conclusion, which is something that the IAEA awards to a state that has reached its highest confidence level, that would also trigger the dissolution of the EU regulation. So what does this mean? It means that the Iranians, if they could get to the broader conclusion, will have more integrated safeguards and less on-the-ground inspections. And this is important and something the Iranians would like to achieve and something the IAEA would like to see the Iranians achieve, because less on-the-ground inspection saves everybody time and money. And the IAEA still has enough information going to its office in Vienna that it is confident there is no diversion. And it does this by placing seals, placing cameras, and placing neutron detection equipment to determine inventory flows on these facilities in Iran. So their information is being sent automatically to the safeguards division in Vienna, and therefore there will be a less of a need for inspectors on the ground. So let's talk about Fordow for a moment. Fordow is another clandestine facility that the Iranians created without the world knowing, that was discovered and basically outed by an Iranian dissident group. And what Fordow is, it's a uranium enrichment facility that's buried deep under a mountain in Iran, so deep that it would be next to impossible, even with nuclear weapons, for any state to destroy it. It would be possible to collapse the tunnels, but you could not feasibly hope to destroy the enrichment halls that are buried deep under this mountain. So what this facility basically was a nuclear weapons factory. This is a facility that was not monitored, was not inspected, that had enough centrifuges in it that over time could produce highly enriched uranium or weapons grade uranium at a rate that would allow the Iranians to begin and maintain a weapons program. So, according to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Fordow has now been converted into a peaceful uses facility. And what that means is that it now produces stable isotopes for applications within agriculture, industry, medicine. Basically, everything it can do now is for the benefit of the Iranian people and for mankind in general, because the Iranian scientists are very good at what they do, and they are making discoveries using stable isotopes. There is no fissionable material allowed in this facility any longer, and they have reduced the number of centrifuges in Fordow so that even if should they start to move away from a peaceful program into a nuclear program, a weapons program, it would be much less adequate to do that in any reasonable period of time. So the deal basically turned Fordow from a weapons production facility into a peaceful uses facility that benefits all of the Iranian community and basically the global community as Iran uses this for its research and development purposes. So I want to talk now about the Joint Commission and the dispute resolution mechanism that I discussed. I mentioned earlier that there's a timed dispute resolution mechanism. So first of all, the Joint Commission is in place so that to establish and monitor working groups. You have working groups that are working on design, working on fuel, working on monitoring fuel, working on the procurement channel. That is part of what the Joint Commission does. The other component of what the Joint Commission does is it monitors the dispute resolution mechanism. Now, why this is so important in non-proliferation and so important to this deal is that there is a time frame on this. In the past, if the IAEA went to a state that had an additional protocol in place and said to that state, this particular facility is something that we would like to inspect, that state could come back to the IAEA and say, that's fine, you can inspect it, but we need 3 months before we'll allow inspectors. After those 3 months expire, the IAEA can come back and say, we'd like to inspect this now, and the state can say, well, we need 3 more months. There was no deadline, there was no time frame put in place for inspections and verification that the IAEA would like to conduct with the state for any facility that they suspected might have clandestine activities. So this really came to a head with the Iranians several years back when there was a facility in northern Tehran called Lavazan, and that's exactly what happened. In the early 2000s, the Iranians were provisionally applying the additional protocol. So the IAEA said to the Iranians, we would like to look at this facility at Lavazan. And the Iranians said, that's fine, but we need 3 months. 3 months later, the IAEA went back and said, okay, we're ready. And the Iranians said, no, we need 3 more months. After 6 months had elapsed, the IAEA inspectors went to the site and discovered that it had been completely bulldozed and asphalted over. So the IAEA inspectors were not able to obtain any kind of realistic environmental samples to give them an idea what might have been occurring at that site before the Iranians had bulldozed it over. So what this deal now provides for is a time limit when it comes to a dispute when it comes for an inspection. So now there's a 24-day time limit. If the IAEA says to the Iranians, we would like to look at this particular facility, and the Iranians, for whatever reason, do not want that to happen, the two entities have 14 days to resolve that. If they do not resolve it, the issue goes to the Joint Commission. The Joint Commission sets up instructions for how they believe the Iranians can comply with the IAEA, and they have a 7-day deadline to do this. Once those instructions are in place, the Iranians have 3 days to comply. So 14 days, 7 days, and then 3 is 24 days. If this issue cannot be resolved within those 24 days, the issue gets sent to the UN Security Council. And the way this works now, once it goes to the Security Council, is the Iranians need to come into compliance. And if they do, the Security Council has to pass a resolution saying, we now believe the Iranians are in compliance or not. If they think the Iranians have come into compliance, the resolution then goes back to the Joint Commission, which will have a majority of vote whether they accept this resolution from the UN. If the Iranians are found not to be in compliance by the UN and there's no resolution, or if the Security Council sends a resolution to the Joint Commission and the majority does not agree that the Iranians are in compliance, then all of the sanctions that had been lifted on the Iranians will snap back. It's called the snap back provision. So this places a time limit. This puts the Iranians under the gun to allow the IAEA to inspect any facility and gives them 24 days to comply with the inspection request. If not, they trigger a process that ultimately could lead to all of their sanctions being snapped back. This is very, very important for the reasons I've said. It's unique. It puts a time frame on it. It doesn't allow them enough time to cleanse a site so that the IAEA can't get the information from the site that they need to determine what the site was being used for. So very important, and also something that is not, it's unique to this deal, has not been agreed to by any other state. So now we've demonstrated that the Iranians have agreed to intrusive inspections to not only their nuclear facilities, but to manufacturing facilities. They have redesigned their research reactor. They have created a stable isotope research facility out of what was a weapons factory. They've agreed to all of these intrusive provisions, including a time limit. So what did they get out of this? Why did the Iranians do this? Well, obviously it's first for sanctions relief. They were provided access to the international banking system. The sanctions, the U.S. sanctions, basically kicked the Iranians out of the international banking system so that they could not receive payment from any other state legally for goods sold. So this would go away and allow them to conduct trade legally in the international banking system. This will allow it to restore its economy. This will allow the Iranians access to restricted funds. Now, if you'll recall, there was a lot of noise made in media about how the Iranians were going to receive a big payoff for agreeing to this deal. And different amounts were put out there, $100 billion, $150 billion. What all of that misinformation revolved around was that the Iranians had approximately $100 billion of their own money frozen in international bank accounts overseas. By complying with the provisions of the deal, what they got in return was access to those restricted funds. So they were getting access to their own money that had been held for about 10 years. Travel bans were going to be lifted on specific individuals. This is something that was also under heavy debate in that there are individuals within the Iranian government and military that many people did not want to see the travel bans lifted on, understanding that there are other travel bans on those same individuals for human rights sanctions and state-sponsored terrorism sanctions. The arms embargo that has been enforced on the Iranians would expire in 5 years. And then ballistic missile technology would be allowed after 8 years. And ultimately, what all of this means is that it would allow for the Iranians to allow for foreign direct investment, which this is what you want. You want to grow your economy. You need other countries to invest in your country.